All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our first entry into our 5-part educational census webinar series. Today's webinar is titled The Importance of the 2020 Census and Data-Driven Marketing Overview. Before we get started, I just want to go through a few quick administrative tips. As an attendee, you are in listen-only mode. There's 2 options to listen. One is to listen over your computer speakers. The other is to dial in. For those of you that are dialing in, you may experience a slight delay as we shift between slides. At the end of the webinar, our speakers will be conducting a Q&A session. And so if at any point you have a question, please use the question entry form on the control panel from your GoToWebinar application. If at any time you need technical support, please access the Help tab or feel free to chat with us directly. And finally, if you have any questions or suggestions regarding our webinar series, please email us at marketingops@civisanalytics.com. In addition, this webinar will be recorded. So after the webinar and within the next 24 hours via email, we will send you a link to the archived version so you can watch at your leisure or share with any of your colleagues. So many of you on today's webinar are already familiar with Civis Analytics, but for those of you who aren't, I wanted to give a quick intro. Civis Analytics is a data science technology and consulting company. We work across government, nonprofit, commercial, and political sectors to help our clients understand populations they're trying to reach. We also empower them through our technology and expertise to create an environment of data-driven decision-making. With our unique blend of proprietary data, technology, and advisory services, our team of data scientists, developers, and survey science experts, Civis helps organizations use statistical proof to guide decisions and stop guessing. So that's a little bit about us. So again, thank you for attending. And at this time, it's time for me to kind of hand over the content portion of this webinar to our census experts. And with that, I'm going to start with Chris Dick, who's our Managing Director of the Public Sector Practice here at Civis Analytics. And he's going to take us forward from here.
Thank you, Kevin. Let me make sure I have access to the slides here. There we go. So my name is Chris Dick. I'm the Managing Director of the Public Sector Practice here at Civis Analytics. Prior to joining Civis, I was both a statistician and branch chief at the U.S. Census Bureau, working in the Population Evaluation Analysis and Projections branch. I've also spent some time at J.D. Power and Associates, leading and now lead our firm-wide public sector work. You're also going to hear today from Jonathan Williams, who works on my team as an applied data science lead and leads a lot of the work that we do around the census. So who should be attending this webinar? The real answer here, who is interested in being involved in or has interest in helping out for the 2020 census, and that is really everyone. We all have a stake in the 2020 census. States and local governments, census-specific committees, nonprofits, federal agencies, including the Census Bureau, political groups, advocacy groups, consultants, students, volunteers, marketing and advertising firms, just generally people who live in the United States as well. We all have a stake because everyone needs to be counted. There we go. All right. So let's talk a little bit about what this webinar series is. So this first of 5 webinars is really going to focus on the importance of the 2020 census, making sure everyone has kind of a level set understanding of the 2020 census, and really talking through at a high level the impact of data-driven marketing on the 2020 census. The next 4 webinars are really going to take deep dives into different parts of data-driven marketing and how they can impact the census. So our second webinar, which will be on October 10th, will really focus on understanding your population and tools, tricks, and data sources that you can use to do that. This will focus on folks like the hard-to-count populations, but also will really give you an overall understanding of your complete population. The next webinar on October 31st, nice scary Halloween webinar, will really focus on what motivates or scares your population and how you can know. We're really going to focus here on things like attitudes and motivators of responding to the census. Again, focusing on both tools and data sources that you can use. Our fourth webinar is going to focus on really implementing your campaigns through the right messenger mode and message. Here we're going to talk a lot about trusted partners as well as different modes of outreach, including in-person outreach. And finally, in January, we're going to have a webinar on in-campaign optimization. The Census Bureau, like they did in 2010, is going to do something really great in 2020 in releasing nightly data on the responses that are coming in from the census. We're going to talk about how you can use these data sources to continue optimizing your campaign during the fielding of the census from about mid-March through the end of April. All right, so what are we going to discuss today? First of all, we're going to talk a little bit about what is the census, why it's important, and really how it works. This is not going to be a full history of the census or a full covering of all of these topics, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page before we really start talking about this last point, and that is what can you do to make sure everyone is counted. And we're going to focus specifically on kind of the different areas of data-driven marketing where you can really help ensure that your community or your interest group is counted. So let's go ahead and start out with the 2020 census overview. This is always one of my favorite photos here. It's the census jug. This was made after the first 1790 census. But really what the census is a once in a decade count of the entire population that is required by our Constitution. And I love the Census Bureau's tagline here of count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. Because of the importance and really the complexity of counting everyone in the country, I mean, that's just a kind of mind-boggling thing of counting all of these folks. We're having to do it in a relatively short period of time. This is really the largest non-military mobilization by the US government, and we do it every single 10 years. So how is the census used? Most folks know about some of the top few uses of the census, but there are numerous uses of the census. One of the first and perhaps constitutionally most important is apportionment, right? So this is, all of our representatives and taxes shall be apportioned among the several states included in the union, and the census is really how we do that. On the right, I have a map of kind of the changes in the number of representatives based on the 2010 census. And this will happen again after the 2020 census. Incredibly important use of the decennial census data. Census data are also used in redistricting. So here again, after each decennial, both congressional as well as state legislative districts may be redrawn in order to ensure equal representation. Here, the key is if we're missing people, especially in a way that's biased, this may well impact the ability to do this redistricting well. But how else is it used? It's also used in federal funding allocation. There's great work that has been done by Andrew Reamer at George Washington University called Counting for Dollars. We have a link to it in this slide here. But the decennial census, as well as products that rely on it, such as the American Community Survey or the population estimates that the Census Bureau creates, are key in allocating over $675 billion in federal funding per year as of fiscal year 2015, according to a Census Bureau report. And some states are really poised to lose more than others based on their population and undercount probabilities. So this is a map here based on Dr. Reamer's research showing the dollars per person that an undercount would have an impact for each of these different states. But more than anything, the census is also our gold standard of data. Decennial census data is used to make numerous business decisions and underlies large swaths of academic research. It also underlies the weighting of every single survey that both the federal government does, as well as many companies like Civis Analytics do as well. So the need for these data to be good really impact things like, where should I locate my new store? What is the likely impact of this new policy? And I love this appendix actually in the Complete Count Committee guide that the Census Bureau has put out. The census data are used in so many more ways than we could even discuss today. They published this appendix in that guide of 50 different ways that census data are used. So things like planning for future government services, or distributing medical research, or drawing school district boundaries. These are all uses of census data. And if the outcome of the census is poor, all of these products and questions are going to be impacted. So there are 50 ways. I'm sure all of you could talk about even more ways that you know that census data kind of impact the way we ask and answer questions. So let's talk about a few issues. One of the things that has garnered the most media attention, and rightly so, is the impact of the potential citizenship question on the propensity to respond for the 2020 census. But there are some other issues as well. Funding for the 2020 census has increased less quickly than in prior decades. So this is a great chart from the Urban Institute, Diana Elliott and Charmaine Runes, created earlier this year. And really what we're seeing here is we've not seen the ramp up that we really need for the Census Bureau and all the great professionals there to really do the work that they need to be able to do. So this chart is showing that that compared to the first 5 years of the decade, we've really seen a much smaller ratio of funding increase going into the census. This has led to a few different issues. First, it's led to less planning and fewer tests than were actually planned for. Other areas the Bureau had already been planning for earlier in the decade to really focus on things like remote address canvassing and fewer non-response follow-up attempts, as well as administrative record use for folks who are less likely to answer. But one other key here, and this goes back to this idea of needing to hire a ton of people, to mobilize a ton of people to actually go knock on doors to do non-response follow-up. As we noted earlier, the decennial census is the largest civilian effort the federal government undertakes. In the 2010 census, what this meant is the Bureau hired nearly 600,000 temporary enumerators. But as the chart on the right shows, unemployment was very high in 2010. We were still coming out of the recession. In 2020, the goal is to hire nearly 500,000 temporary enumerators, but we're also at historically low levels of unemployment. This has led to a lot of problems in trying to ramp up the hiring for the Bureau. So this is another issue that we're dealing with. I also mentioned non-response follow-up, or NRFU, as I like to call it, because it's fun to say, which is the process by which the Census Bureau follows up with those who do not self-respond. In 2010, the census non-response follow-up included 6 attempts at each person's door. In 2020, it will only include 3 attempts. Now, the Census Bureau is planning to use other methods such as administrative data to really ensure that we are getting quality data, but this will have an impact on the outcome of the census. I also want to talk a little bit about expected self-response. So how many people are going to actually respond to the census by themselves in the cheapest and highest quality way, which is them actually responding for them and their family. So for 2020, the Census Bureau expects a 61% or 60.5% self-response rate. This is definitely much lower than it was in the 2010 census, and something that really increases the burden of non-response follow-up. Again, this is the expectation of the Census Bureau. There are things that could happen that would decrease this self-response rate, especially among certain groups. So that's something where all of us really have a chance to help impact and hopefully raise this number in our communities. So the story here overall is that everyone needs to get involved to really ensure a complete count. The Census Bureau has a lot of issues that they're having to deal with in the 2020 census, including things like lower budgets than expected and less census tests than expected. This means that even compared to a regular census like we had in 2010, where there still needs to be a lot of community involvement, we need even more community involvement in the 2020 census. But given that everyone's time and money is limited, the key here is that we also want to have an efficient and effective outreach and helping of the Census Bureau and to ensure this very important complete count. So let's talk a little bit about what the timeline looks like. I know a lot of folks who are on this call are already involved in helping their communities or their groups do outreach for the census, but I do want to just do a quick reminder of some of the key dates for the decennial census. So one of the most important things for your community or for your group is to develop a complete count committee. I know most of you are probably already involved in these complete count committees, but if your community doesn't have one yet, there's still time. Please try to develop that complete count committee as soon as possible. One of the things that happened in the past, sorry, we should have talked about this earlier, is the local update of census addresses. So this helps to create the list that the Census Bureau used to ensure that they know which doors, which homes, and which addresses to send the postcard or the paper form to let people respond to the census. Currently, and about to end, there's also address canvassing going on. So this is going out and checking some of those areas to ensure that the addresses are correct, both in person and from the office in Suitland. In January 2020, two things are going to happen. Number one, the awareness campaign for the census is going to kick off. So this is the big campaign that the Census Bureau is doing. All of you in your localities and your different groups want to be working together with that campaign to ensure that you have a local spin on it as well. But at the same time, the count also begins in remote Alaska, where they do in-person enumeration. In March 2020, we're going to see census postcards and paper forms sent to most homes. And beginning around that same time through the end of April, we're going to have a motivation and participation campaign by the Census Bureau. Again, your chance here to work together in your community to help get that message out there. And finally, April 1, 2020 is Census Day. Beginning in May and July of 2020, the Census Bureau is going to start non-response follow-up. So this is where they're going to actually send enumerators out to people's doors. And then the very interesting stuff, by December 31st, 2020, the apportionment numbers are released both publicly and delivered to the president. And then by March of 2021, those redistricting files are delivered to the states. So I'm going to go ahead and jump here now into our next slide, if it will let me go forward. And I'm going to pass it over to Jonathan Williams on my team to talk about how we can use data-driven marketing to really ensure the most a good outcome for the most important campaign.
Thank you, Chris, and thanks, Kevin, for kicking this off. So Chris just gave you an overview of the 2020 census, why the self-response portion is going to be so important to the census, and why in this cycle, achieving a sort of a high self-response rate will be particularly difficult to achieve. So on my end, I would like to provide you with an overview of what Civis believes might be a good multi-step process for organizations such as your own to come together and maximize that self-response portion using methods more commonly seen in marketing analytics. I say marketing analytics because I think most of you will be familiar with the vocabulary of audiences and messaging. But in reality, these methods, these techniques are used not just in the commercial space, but also for nonprofits and also in the political sphere as well. The 2020 self-response maximization is sometimes referred to as get out the count, as a sort of obvious parallel to the political get out the vote campaigns. I bring this up to make the point that in many ways, these are defined known problems with defined known solutions. And I think that if people have put in a lot of hard work and time into figuring out how to get people to fill out a ballot for a candidate, then we should borrow those methods to learn how to get folks to fill out a census form. The 5 topics on this page, understanding a population, figuring out why they are easy or hard to count, determining the messages or modes or agents to distribute the messages, implementation of a campaign, and optimization or reallocation of resources are 5 parts of a process, but they will also form 5 parts, 5 separate webinar sessions after this, as Kevin and Chris have mentioned. So I know that in this webinar today, we're going to be talking about things at a very high level. And if you start to think, well, I've heard all this before, I hope you will tune in for some of these other seminars that are about deep dives into these topics, not just the challenges, but also how Civis believes that they can be solved. Let's start with understanding the population you want to reach. Defining your problem is usually the first step in any process. Many of the people on this webinar might represent national efforts to maximize the census count. Others might have particular localities, such as states or counties, cities, where they need to maximize the count. And still others might be trying to boost the count within subpopulations or interest groups, which cut across geographies. So figuring out exactly where you're going to be focusing your efforts and what a definition of success would be is, of course, always a good first step. I'm going to be trying to illustrate some of my concepts as I walk through these slides with a few screen caps, leaning heavily on an online mapping application of estimated self-response scores, or 2010 self-response scores, put together by the folks at the City Universities of New York. So I want to commend them. It's a very nice tool. We have a link to it here. They'll go out with our recording later. But it's one of many tools that are being developed in a sort of free or open source way for anyone, no matter their resources, to begin to get a handle on the size of the problem here. So first, who are you trying to reach? I mentioned earlier that defining your audience, I'm going to use audience and subpopulation more or less interchangeably here. Defining your audience is an important first step. Census can create some sort of unique audiences or populations compared to more traditional marketing analytics efforts. For example, I have outlined in green here New York's 14th Congressional District, currently represented by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And if you were trying to work with is that it's a very interesting geography in that it contains parts, but only parts, of both Queens and the Bronx. So that's not something you come across every day, reaching that particular geography. You'll also notice from all the orange and red on this map that there's quite a few areas within that congressional district where, based off of 2010 results, we expect a fairly low self-response rate, which will need to be mitigated as much as possible. Once you know your audience, once you've defined your population, understanding is the next crucial part. What do you know about them? Understanding, in my opinion, takes 2 forms: insights and data. They play well together. Leaning on just one by itself is usually not a winning formula. So I'm sure that each of you have missions in mind, and you already have either insights or data, or ideally both. And I would encourage you all to start thinking about how to pull together what you need. If you have the data, who can you turn to for insights? If you have insights, who has your data? Just as sort of a toy example here, I've pulled up a map of Tallahassee, Florida, where I grew up. I didn't know Tallahassee's hard-to-count scores. It wasn't something I thought much about in high school. But now that I have the data, I'm looking at it, and I can use my insights, and I know that the low response rates on the west side of town are almost certainly due to the fact that those are heavy student residence centers from Florida State University and Florida A&M, where there's a great deal of turnover year to year. People are generally not listed correctly because their addresses are out of date, and they may not even be in town in some of the months that the census effort is being undertaken. So that combination of data and insight together allows me to start tackling this problem better. Okay. When it comes to understanding the population, I think the last step is, are they likely to respond? Are these easy to reach, easy to count people, or are they harder to count? Tools like this City University of New York mapping service or the Census Bureau's own ROAM tool are really helpful starts in exploring your data. I think that once you explore the data, once you start to form hypotheses, you'll want to turn to other sources of data or research or analysis to refine it. But these are excellent starting points for understanding just the scale of your challenge. I also want to emphasize that the populations you might be interested in could all be described by a simple term, for example, residents of Illinois or lower income households in Chicago's 18th Ward. But no matter how narrowly you're slicing it, there's bound to be some heterogeneity. When you take a look at a map, or if you take a look at a set of self-response scores, and you see some low self-response scores and some high self-response scores, I don't want you to think of that as just two different populations, one low, one high. In reality, the people who make up either of those groups come from many different walks, and reaching them or persuading them will often take different approaches. So that section we just concluded was about understanding your audience. And that will be the focus of the next webinar here from Civis. This next section presumes you've already reached that step. You know who your audience is, you've defined them, and you know whether they're hard to reach or easy to reach. Next, the next step is understanding why. Why do they want to answer, or why do they not want to answer the census? And at Civis, we are generally of the belief that if you want to know why somebody is doing something, the best method is just to ask them. Survey research, when performed well, there's no substitute. It's the way to go. Survey research leading to answers of why people have barriers to self-response is particularly important with the census because there's not a lot of carrots or sticks that we can use to really get people to respond. You can't pay people to complete the census, and although the census is in some senses considered mandatory, this is not something where we want to lean on people and say, like, you're required by law to fill out the census. That's not going to work. So since we can't use carrots or sticks, we have to understand what their specific concerns are and then address them. That's pretty much the only way through. Scientifically valid survey research is the way to do it. The idea is, through survey research, to take a large population, which may have different groups inside of it, which have yet to be seen and understood, and help break them down into folks who are definitely going to respond to the census, and people who won't respond to the census or are less likely to respond to the census, but for different reasons. For example, in some of the early survey research that Civis has done, you can identify at least two groups of people who may not wish to respond to the census, one of which we're calling apathetic non-responders, people who may just not see the point in it, have not been convinced of the value, don't understand the stakes, and another who are actively not responding out of, in this case, privacy concerns. There are other reasons that people may actively not wish to respond to the census, but at least one group of them have concerns about what happens to the data once it's given to the government. We strongly recommend survey research for understanding why people are not answering the census. But some of this has been done, and I don't want to reinvent the wheel. The Census Bureau itself puts out the CBAMS, the Census Barriers, Attitudes, and Motivators Study. That's a nationwide study that attempts to figure out what are the blockers, or why are people saying that they are less likely to respond. That's a good starting point. And depending on who your population is, you may wish to consider additional research, fielding surveys of your own, or just looking to see what has been done with folks more like your own population. Because your population may have specific concerns that were less easy to see in a nationwide study like the CBAMS. If you'll pardon a bit of levity here, thinking of survey research, especially on the census, always brings me to mind this old Far Side cartoon. There are challenges with survey research, and a lot of this is kind of self-evident in a way. If you distribute a survey to people asking why they won't respond to surveys like the census, you may not get a great result back. There are some kind of obvious response biases or selection biases at work here. So I think we all knew going in this is not an easy process. There are always complications. But some of the issues here are how do you weight your survey about census accuracy when many people use census results for their weights? How do you get honest information from people who don't like to provide information? That's the one thing we know about them. And how do especially private actors create a good survey panel when trying to address who will be counted in the U.S. Census, given that people counted by the census are not the same as what you might find in a standard web-based or telephone-based survey panel. They may not be 18 years old, they may not be born in the United States, they may not have a consumer record. Many of these people are less visible to traditional forms of survey research. So that just concluded a second topic about finding out why people will or will not respond to the census. And that will be a second webinar. The third topic in this multi-step process is once you've identified what people's concerns are, trying to find out how to persuade them. What messages will most move the needle? And this also involves, the solution to this will also involve, in many cases, good experimental design, scientific processes. In this case, message testing, ideally done in the format of a randomized controlled trial, something more like a pharmacological trial with a control group and experimental groups. This allows you to see whether messages are creating significant changes in people's attitudes. It also allows you to see whether some messages might provoke backlash. Civis does a lot of message testing itself, and we see this across our commercial, nonprofit, political, and public sector spheres, that the wrong message will actually drive people away from what you're trying to get them to do. We've done some early work around the census itself. And from that, for example, we've noticed that messages which try to boast about the security of the data associated with the census actually have a strong, well, at least a weak backlash effect across the board. No matter how secure the census's protocols will be for 2020, it seems that simply the act of talking about security, raising awareness of the risks involved with online data or government storage of data, is enough to get people feeling antsy and less likely to respond. Message testing like this also allows you to start differentiating different groups of people and what levers they respond to most. For example, again, using some of our early research in this area, we found that Hispanic audiences were less motivated or less persuaded by messages that the census was a civic duty, and more motivated by messages that focused on the idea that the census was a way to win representation and perhaps political power for their communities. Maybe on the face of it, that has a ring of common sense or even obviousness, but we can extrapolate or generalize from this example to what will motivate less intuitively defined populations. Before I move on from this topic, I also want to caveat my own background is in statistics. Good survey research like this, good message testing like this, will also give you a margin of error. That's very important because in many cases, you know, the sample sizes may number in the hundreds, but the hundreds will not give you a definite 100% certain look into what will happen in the real world when we field it to millions of Americans. You should try to take action only on messages where you feel reasonably certain that you know what's going to happen. And sometimes, depending on how narrowly you cut your audiences or who you can reach, we have to all admit to ourselves that the data may point in one direction or another, but it won't be completely obvious what conclusion to draw from that. So that was the third topic, finding the messages that will persuade people. Our fourth topic is going to be about implementing and measuring against your plan, your outreach, your strategy, translating that understanding into action. So you'll have defined your audience, you'll have estimated the response rates, you'll have learned about their barriers to self-response, and ideally you'll have found persuasive messages, which will convince the very people who are least likely to fill out their census forms to change their mind. That would be a great place to be in, but even if you're there, there's still plenty of work left to do. You have to match your successful messages with a good delivery medium. You have to work with your partners, because very few organizations who work on census are doing it alone. You have to make your case about what you've done and why it's likely to succeed, and what you will need from or what you can supply to your partner organizations. You need to support their outreach. And finally, as step to any implementation of a plan, I think you need to determine, what would success look like? What is a good result? How do I measure it? Will I be able to measure it? What would a significant success look like as opposed to a marginal success? So all of these topics will be discussed more in this fourth webinar we plan to hold later this year. I have a picture here on the right-hand side of the screen, an example from a software tool that Civis is putting together. We call the Census Intelligence Center. And it demonstrates a way that you can take research, sort of what we know mathematically or statistically about a population, in an automated fashion, package it into a one-page PDF that you can hand out to canvassers or people going door to door, people who are holding meetings with communities, giving them the facts they know in the format they understand, easily, speedily, and at scale. That's going to be very important, partly because, as Chris mentioned, census in 2020, as in every year, but maybe even more so today, is about efficiency. We have only so many resources. We can hire only so many staff. Reducing overhead and finding models which scale effectively is going to be of paramount importance here. Okay, the last of the 5 topics, and also the last of the 5 following webinars we're going to hold, centers around optimizing during the census campaign itself. I say optimization, you might say reallocation of resources. You have a certain number of volunteers, you have a certain amount of advertising spend, and your question is, when we have our first results, when we begin to see what's going on, is there a way that we can apply our remaining resources most effectively? So one tool which might help with that is that for the 2020 census, the Census Bureau plans to release daily self-response totals at a census tract level and provide them publicly, at least over a period from March 20th to April 30th. These daily self-response totals will be very valuable, especially because they come at such a narrow geography as the census tract level. There are limited comparisons we can make to 2010, but that will be a topic for this 5th seminar, because it's direct comparisons of the 2020 totals to 2010 will be complicated at best. And in reality, a lot of our communities have drifted over the past 10 years. There's been a lot of demographic change. So it's not clear where the baseline will be in relation to 2010. However, being able to measure against similar census tracts today in 2020, or I guess next year in 2020, will have some immediate benefit in helping you to understand where you might be succeeding, where you might need more work, and where you could allocate some of your remaining resources. Civis Analytics also thinks that there's a potential here for natural experiments, if you will. Many organizations are planning interventions, broadly defined, of some kind. An intervention could be hosting a series of community events. It could mean a novel advertising program. You can create test beds of census tracts or other geographies that could be mapped to census tracts. And as the census evolves, as the count evolves and the response totals come in, you can start to see where your interventions might be succeeding or failing relative to good control tracts. We think that this is a potential way forward for campaigns, get out the count campaigns, to rapidly redeploy resources or move towards or away from certain messages during the census itself, which is a great benefit because otherwise you have to just wait for the end, see how you did, and that's it, nothing more to be done. But here we might have a way to track early whether you're creating greater than expected levels of success with any of your planned interventions.
All right. Well, thanks, Jonathan, and thank you, Chris, for taking us through all that great content. At this point, I wanted to open up to questions from our attendees, and keep in mind that you are in a listen-only mode. So if you do have a question, please use the control panel. So the first question that came in during the conversation was, do you know what kind of data the census will be distributing in nightly updates?
I think I could take some of that. Yeah. My understanding is that based off each day's count, the census will, with potentially a day or two delay, be releasing the self-response rate in 2020, an equivalent total self-response rate from 2010. That is not where the count was